You are a burden in my life. Ever since your father died, I can't stand you." The stepmother abandoned the 3-year-old girl in the forest. But 10 years later, something unexpected happened. The Lombardo mansion had always been a reflection of the family's power, wealth, and impeccable lineage. But that night, among the marble-covered walls and the chandeliers that barely illuminated the luxurious dining room, a cruel act was taking place. Isabella Lombardo, an 8-year-old girl with tangled hair and tears trapped in her large eyes, stood trembling, her gaze locked onto her stepmother. The woman who should have been her protector, her refuge, was her executioner. Victoria Lombardo held a glass of wine in her hand, her expression filled with contempt, her silhouette flawless in an elegant black dress. She raised her glass with a theatrical gesture, as if she were about to toast to a victory. "Ever since your father died, I can't stand you." Her voice rang out, dry, sharp, devoid of any humanity. Isabella pressed her lips together. She didn't understand why Victoria hated her so much. Ever since her father, Samuel Lombardo, had died under strange circumstances, everything she knew had changed. The house that had once been her home had become a silent battlefield where she was the only victim. No one defended her. No one even seemed to notice. Leonardo Lombardo, Victoria's biological son, sat at the table, watching the scene with discomfort. At 16, he was a kind-hearted young man, but he had learned to keep quiet to avoid his mother's wrath. He looked away, unable to bear the sight of the girl's suffering. "Victoria, you shouldn't talk to her like that," he said in a low voice. Victoria let out a bitter laugh and set her glass down on the table forcefully. "And what do you suggest I do, Leonardo? Raise her as if she were my own daughter? Carry the burden of this brat who reminds me every day of the worst decision I ever made?" Isabella felt a knot form in her throat. She didn't understand those words. Her father had loved her, or at least she had thought so. But now, Victoria was making her feel like an intruder in her own home. Victoria leaned closer, her eyes cold as steel. "Listen to me carefully, Isabella. You are a burden. Everything you had because Samuel felt guilty, but I won't keep up this charade. Do you want to know the truth? Your father wasn't the wonderful man you think he was. He was a liar, a coward, and," she smiled with inexplicable cruelty, "he didn't even want you to be born." Isabella felt her world shatter. Her small hands clenched the fabric of her dress, struggling to hold back the tears. She didn't want to cry. Not in front of her. Leonardo shot to his feet. "Stop it, Mom. You have no right to talk to her like that." Victoria glared at him. "Sit down," her tone was ice cold. "Don't you dare question me. That girl is nothing to us." Leonardo wanted to argue, but he knew that any words would only make things worse. Isabella, on the other hand, felt fear slither over her skin like poison. She couldn't stay there. She couldn't keep enduring this. That night, Victoria made a decision. One she had planned for a long time. Hours later, when the clock struck midnight and the storm raged over the city, Victoria dragged Isabella out of the mansion. The girl barely had time to react before she was shoved into a car. The rain pounded violently against the windshield as the vehicle moved down a dirt road, getting farther and farther from the city. "Where are we going?" Isabella asked, her voice trembling. Victoria didn't answer. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. There was a dark, almost inhuman expression on her face. The car came to a stop in the middle of a dense forest, where the trees stood tall like menacing giants. Victoria opened the door and yanked Isabella out roughly. "Get out." Isabella shivered. She looked around. There were no houses, no lights, only darkness and the sound of thunder rumbling in the sky. "Please, don't leave me here," she pleaded, her voice breaking. Victoria stared at her for a long moment. Her eyes were two bottomless voids. Then, without another word, she turned around, got into the car, and drove away. The sound of the engine faded into the distance. Isabella was alone. The wind whistled through the trees. The rain soaked her clothes. Her legs trembled. She couldn't stay still. She couldn't give up. She had to find her way back. She started walking aimlessly. Every shadow among the trees looked like a lurking monster. Every sound in the underbrush made her heartbeat quicken. Her small bare feet stumbled over the damp roots, but she kept going. Then she heard it. A growl. She froze. A few meters away, through the mist, two glowing eyes stared at her. A black dog emerged from the shadows. It was enormous, its wet fur glistening in the rain. Its gaze was piercing, as if it were evaluating her. Isabella held her breath. The animal took a step forward. Her instinct screamed at her to run, but she had no strength left. The dog growled again, but instead of attacking, it tilted its head. Then, slowly, it turned and began to walk, stopping every few steps to look back at her. Isabella understood what it was doing. Frightened, but with no other choice, she followed. The dog led her through the forest, dodging branches and crossing small streams. She didn't know how long she walked. Her legs ached. Her head felt heavy. Until, suddenly, a faint light appeared between the trees. A cabin. The door creaked open slowly, and an old woman with deep, knowing eyes watched her from the threshold. "I knew you would come," she said in a low, almost whispering voice. Isabella, exhausted and on the verge of collapse, fell to her knees. Before she lost consciousness, she heard the old woman's final words. "You are stronger than you think, child. And your story is just beginning." In the distance, hidden among the trees, someone watched in silence. The girl was not alone. Someone else was in the darkness. And they were waiting. The cabin smelled of aged wood and dried herbs. Isabella felt the warmth of the fireplace against her cold, soaked skin, but her mind remained trapped in the image of the old woman staring at her from the threshold. The girl could barely stay awake, but before her body gave in, she heard a whisper in the darkness. "Rest. I won't let them find you." Her body collapsed into a deep sleep, immersing her in the first feeling of safety she had experienced in a long time. When she woke up, the cabin was illuminated by the dim morning light. Her clothes had been changed into a wool dress that smelled of lavender. The sound of a spoon striking a pot echoed through the room. "You finally opened your eyes. I thought you might sleep for an entire week." The old woman's voice was firm, yet tinged with a warmth that Isabella found strangely comforting. Isabella sat up slowly. Her body ached. Her mind took a few seconds to remember what had happened. Her stepmother, the forest, the black dog. Her gaze traveled around the cabin until it landed on the animal lying beside the fireplace. Its dark eyes watched her with an almost human attentiveness. "Sombra didn't take his eyes off you all night," said the old woman as she poured steaming broth into a clay bowl. "It seems he has decided to look after you." A lump formed in Isabella's throat. For the first time in a long time, someone seemed to care about her. "Who are you?" Her voice was barely a whisper. The old woman placed the bowl in front of her and sat down on a carved wooden chair. "My name is Rosario. I live here because the world out there is full of vipers, and I've been bitten enough times." Isabella took the spoon and tasted the broth. It was warm, with a comforting flavor. "Why did you help me?" Rosario studied her carefully before answering. "Because I know what it's like to be abandoned." Isabella lowered her gaze. Her heart ached. "She hates me," her voice trembled. "That's because she can't hate herself," Rosario replied calmly. "When someone is full of poison, the only thing they know how to do is poison others." There were many things Isabella didn't understand. Her young mind couldn't yet process all the darkness that surrounded her. But she understood one thing: her life, as she had known it, was over. Days passed, and little by little, Isabella began to adapt to life in the cabin. Rosario taught her how to light a fire with damp wood, how to recognize poisonous herbs, and how to hunt with rudimentary traps. "I don't want you to be strong just to survive," the old woman would say as she showed her how to sharpen a stone. "I want you to be strong so no one can ever trample you again." Isabella absorbed every lesson with the intensity of someone who had lost everything. Sombra followed her everywhere. On stormy nights, he slept at the foot of her bed. When she fell into the river trying to catch fish, The dog would leap in after her and pull her back to shore. Rosario observed the bond between the girl and the animal with interest. That dog is more than just a guide for you, child. He's a reminder that even in the deepest darkness, there are those who will find you and show you the way. Years passed, and Isabella's innocence began to fade. Her gaze became sharper, her mind more calculating. She learned to hunt with a bow, to move silently through the forest, to read people's gestures, and to detect lies in their eyes. Rosario taught her more than just survival. People think strength is in their fists, but real strength is here. She tapped her temple with a finger. The mind is the most powerful weapon you will ever have. Isabella absorbed every word. She became a natural strategist, an observer of the smallest details. One night, as Sombra slept by the fireplace, Rosario called her with a grave voice. "Come. There's something you need to know." Isabella sat in front of her. "I've kept this secret for years, but it's time you heard it." Rosario took a deep breath. "I know the Lombardos." Isabella felt the world stop. "What?" Rosario looked at her intently. "I am not just an old woman living in the forest. Many years ago, I was part of the world you came from." Isabella's heart pounded. "Your father, Samuel Lombardo, he wasn't the man you think he was." The word struck Isabella like a storm. "No," she whispered. "That's not true." Rosario let her process the revelation before continuing. "He was a powerful man, but not all power comes from honesty. There were things he did, things you don't want to know." Isabella felt nauseous. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I want you to understand something before it's too late." Rosario's eyes darkened. Hatred is a double-edged sword. If you use it wrong, you'll end up cutting yourself. Isabella remained silent. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat beside Sombra, running her fingers through his fur while her mind filled with questions. More years passed. Isabella's body became stronger. Her hands, once fragile, were now firm. Her voice, once trembling, now carried sharp confidence. One day, Rosario called her to a clearing in the forest. "Today is the day," her voice was solemn. "You are no longer the girl I found." Isabella stood still. "Now you have the power to choose. You can stay here and live far from the world's poison, or you can go back and reclaim what was taken from you." The wind whispered through the trees. Isabella clenched her fists. "I'm going back." Rosario nodded with a sad smile. "Then go and prove that you were never broken." Sombra stood up and positioned himself beside her. "Are you coming with me?" The dog didn't answer, but his eyes said everything. With the moon lighting her path, Isabella left the cabin behind. She was ready. It was time to return. The city looked different. Isabella watched through the window of the black car as it drove through streets illuminated by the neon lights of the buildings. Too much time had passed, and yet the memories of that house, of those streets, were etched into her mind like invisible scars. Sombra sat beside her in the back seat. His presence gave her the security she needed. She ran her fingers through his dark fur as her cold eyes took in the imposing building where, years ago, her father had built his empire. Now, that same empire was crumbling. The chauffeur pulled up in front of an exclusive restaurant in the city center. Isabella adjusted her designer black dress and stepped out with the calculated elegance she had perfected over the years. Her posture was impeccable, her gaze a mixture of coldness and confidence. She had taken on a new identity, Isabella Montenegro. No one should ever connect her to the girl abandoned in the forest. She entered the restaurant with purposeful steps, drawing the attention of several diners. She knew her presence was commanding, and that was part of her strategy. She walked toward a reserved table where the man she had been closely following since her return was waiting, Leonardo Lombardo. He watched her curiously as she sat across from him. He had changed. He was no longer the timid teenager she remembered, but a man with sharp features, an air of mystery, and eyes that scrutinized every detail of her face. I don't think we've met before, he said, leaning slightly toward her. That's because I'm not easy to find, Isabella replied with a faint smirk. Leonardo studied her for a few seconds before nodding in approval. I've heard you're a powerful investor. I must admit, I'm curious as to why someone like you is interested in our company. Isabella took a sip of wine before responding. Let's just say I like investing in companies on the verge of collapse. It's like bringing something dead back to life. Leonardo let out a short laugh, but there was a flicker of wounded pride in his eyes. We're not dead. We just need a little push. A push? Isabella raised an eyebrow. The truth is, you're on the brink of bankruptcy. Your mother has made terrible decisions over the past few years, and now she's desperate for help. Leonardo clenched his jaw at the mention of his mother. Victoria can still regain what she lost. Isabella rested her elbows on the table, looking at him with calculated intensity. Victoria is at her weakest. And when people are desperate, they will do anything to survive. Leonardo watched her in silence. There was something about her that unsettled him. What's your real interest in this? You don't seem like someone who's just here to make business deals. Isabella gave him an enigmatic smile. My interest is to see just how far the Lombardos are willing to go to reclaim what they lost. The waiter arrived with their dinner, and the conversation shifted to trivial matters. But the tension between them remained in the air. Later that night, as Isabella returned to her hotel, she received a message. It was Victoria. The woman had accepted her investment proposal and requested an urgent meeting. Everything was going according to plan. The next day, Isabella stepped inside the old Lombardo mansion. The place had lost its grandeur. The furniture no longer had its former shine, the hallways were darker, and a sense of decay lingered in every corner. Victoria greeted her in the main lounge. The woman had changed. Her beauty was still intact, but her eyes reflected a weariness that hadn't been there before. You're younger than I expected, she said with a tight smile as she poured herself a glass of wine. Age doesn't determine power, Isabella replied, settling onto the leather sofa. Victoria took a sip before speaking. I've heard you want to invest in our company. I want to know what you expect in return. Isabella observed her calmly. I just want to see if there's anything left standing of the Lombardos. Victoria frowned. We're stronger than we seem. That's what everyone says before they fall, Isabella said with a sharp smile. Victoria let out a brief laugh, but her eyes analyzed her closely. You remind me of someone. Isabella held her gaze. Sometimes, shadows from the past return. Victoria looked away as if her own thoughts unsettled her. Tell me something, Isabella. Do you believe in fate? No, I believe in revenge. The tension in the room became unbearable. Victoria finished the last sip of her wine and stood up. I'll see you at the meeting. Isabella stood as well. Very soon, as she walked out of the mansion, her heart pounded. She was succeeding. She was inside. But when she arrived at her hotel, something sent a chill down her spine. A black envelope lay on her bed. With trembling hands, she opened it and pulled out a note with a single sentence. Your father never died. The paper slipped from her fingers onto the floor. Her entire body tensed. Someone knew the truth, and they were watching her. The black envelope was still on the floor, motionless, as if its mere presence filled the room with a dark, suffocating energy. Isabella stood there, feeling the cold crawl over her skin, as if someone were watching her from the shadows. Her eyes scanned the note once more, as if the words might change just by looking at them. Your father never died. Her breathing slowed. It wasn't possible. Everything she knew, everything she had built in her mind over the years, wavered under the weight of that single sentence. The sound of Sombra shifting restlessly beside her snapped her out of her thoughts. The dog sniffed the envelope and let out a low growl, as if he sensed something she couldn't see. She crouched down, carefully picked up the note, and brought it closer to the light. No sender, no stamp, no indication of who had sent it. Just those words, screaming an impossible truth. Samuel Lombardo was dead. She knew it. She remembered. Victoria had buried him. The news had confirmed it. The whole world believed it. But if this were true, who had ensured she never looked beyond the obvious? She sat on the bed, still clutching the letter, and closed her eyes. She couldn't let this derail her plan. She was already inside, pulling the strings from the shadows, slowly wearing Victoria down. This wasn't the time to lose control. But something inside her burned. If her father was alive, it meant someone had lied to her entire life. And she had to find out who. She grabbed her phone and dialed a number. "I need information," she whispered as soon as the voice on the other end picked up. "On Samuel Lombardo." The man on the other end didn't respond immediately. A heavy silence filled the line before he spoke. "That'll cost more than usual." "I don't care." Isabella rubbed her temple, feeling rage mix with her need for answers. "Get me everything you can find. I'll call you when I have something." She hung up and remained in the room, feeling the air grow heavier. Someone knew the truth, and they were daring her to find it. That same night, Isabella attended another dinner with the Lombardos. Leonardo greeted her at the entrance of the restaurant, his gaze locked onto her, as if he were trying to decipher her. "You seem tense," he said as they walked toward the private table he had reserved. "Business can be exhausting," she replied with a rehearsed smile, but Leonardo didn't buy it. They sat down, and the atmosphere between them felt different. There was a tension that hadn't been there before, a silent connection that seemed to intensify with every glance. "I don't think you're the kind of woman who gets tired from business." Leonardo tilted his head slightly, studying her every move. "Oh, no. I think it's something else." Isabella took a sip of wine and held his gaze. "I'm surprised you care." Leonardo smirked with a hint of irony. "You intrigue me." "I can't help it." Their conversation was interrupted when Victoria arrived at the restaurant. Her presence was always imposing, but now her expression bore the weight of years and the pressure of impending ruin. Isabella watched her carefully. There was something in her face she hadn't noticed before. It wasn't just the desperation of a woman on the edge. It was fear. After dinner, Leonardo offered to walk her to her car. "I don't trust anyone in this world," Isabella said as they walked. "Everyone lies. Even me?" Leonardo looked at her seriously. Isabella stopped and held his gaze. "I don't know yet." Leonardo took a slow breath, stepping just a few inches closer. "And you? Are you lying right now?" For a moment, Isabella felt her mask crack. "I always lie." She got into the car before he could respond. That night, when she returned to the hotel, Sombra was gone. Her heart stopped for a second. She called for him. Searched every corner. Nothing. The dog never left her side without a reason. Something was wrong. She stepped onto the street, her gaze sweeping over the shadows in search of any clue. The city at night felt colder, more hostile. Then her phone rang. She answered immediately. "Where is he?" she demanded, her voice tense. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, but its icy tone sent a chill down her spine. "Stop looking, or you'll end up like your mother." The line went dead. Isabella felt her entire body tense. Her mother. No one talked about her. No one. She clenched her fists and stared into the darkness of the city. The hunt had just begun. The night wind was freezing. Isabella could feel the cold biting at her skin as she stood on the balcony of her room, her gaze fixed on the city sprawling before her like a labyrinth of lights and shadows. Her thoughts were trapped in the words she had heard over the phone. Stop searching, or you'll end up like your mother." A chill ran down her spine. No one spoke about her mother. No one mentioned her name, not even in whispers. She had grown up believing that her mother had died under unknown circumstances and that her father had never wanted to talk about it. But now, someone had sent her a clear message. Her mother had died for a reason, and she was about to find out why. Sombro was still missing. More than a day had passed since she had last seen him, and that wasn't normal. The dog never left her side. Never. Someone had taken him. She clenched her fists. She could not afford to falter. Everything she had built, her new identity, her plan, her revenge, all of it was at stake. But now, something even bigger than her hatred stood in her way. She picked up her phone and dialed the number of the private investigator she had hired to track down Samuel Lombardo. "Tell me you have something." Much more than you expected, the voice on the other end replied. "But you'll want to hear this in person." "Where?" "I'll send you the location." The call ended. Isabella changed clothes and left the hotel with determined steps. The black car was waiting at the entrance, the chauffeur glancing at her from the corner of his eye. "Take me here," she ordered, showing him the message on her phone. The car started and disappeared into the darkness of the city. When she arrived at the meeting point, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, the investigator was already waiting for her. He was an older man, with a scar on his cheek and eyes that had clearly seen too much in life. "This better be worth it," Isabella said coldly. The man handed her an envelope. Samuel Lombardo never died. Her heart stopped for a second before pounding harder. "What are you saying?" "He faked his own death. And not just that, he did it with Umberto's help." The world tilted beneath her feet. Umberto. Her godfather. The man her father had always trusted as his best friend. She tore open the envelope with trembling hands. Inside were documents, reports, photos. And in one of them, a man standing with his back turned, gray-haired, but unmistakable. She would recognize that silhouette anywhere. Samuel Lombardo was alive. Her fingers curled around the photo, her body burning with fury. "Where is he?" The investigator shook his head. "He's not easy to find. He's been working in the shadows for years. But if he knows you're looking for him, he already knows." A deep rage settled inside her. She had built her entire life on a lie. Her hatred for Victoria, her revenge, everything had been based on the belief that her father had died, leaving behind a legacy of ruin. But now she knew the truth. Samuel wasn't just alive. He had been pulling the strings all along. The investigator handed her another envelope. "That's not all I found." She tore it open quickly. Financial records. Payments made in Victoria Lombardo's name. Secret transfers, hidden accounts. This doesn't make sense. Victoria and Samuel had no connection. The investigator stared at her. "That's not true. Victoria wasn't working against Samuel. She was trying to protect you from him." The words hit her like a slap. "No. For years, she tried to keep you away from him. It was her who left you in the forest, because it was the only way to save you." Isabella felt the air grow heavy. Everything she thought she knew, every bit of hatred she had clung to, was crumbling before her eyes. Victoria had been protecting her, and she had spent her entire life trying to destroy Victoria. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. She looked at the screen. A message. "Come back. It's urgent." It was Donna Rosario. Her heart pounded. Without wasting another second, she left the warehouse and ordered the driver to take her to the cabin immediately. But when she arrived, only silence greeted her. She pushed the door open hard. The scent of herbs always lingered in the cabin. But now there was something else. A bitter, metallic smell. The smell of death. She froze. Rosario was sitting in her wooden chair, her empty gaze fixed on the unlit fireplace. Rosario. No response. She reached out gently and touched her shoulder. The body slumped to the side, lifeless. Isabella covered her mouth with her hand to stop the scream from escaping. An empty glass bottle rolled onto the floor, its label barely readable. Poison. Her legs felt weak. Dona Rosario had been poisoned. She fell to her knees beside her, feeling the burn of tears in her eyes. No, but it was too late. Her mentor, her only mother figure, dead. Her chest filled with an icy, relentless fury. Someone had taken the only pure thing she had left in her life. And they would pay. She stood up, fists clenched, eyes darkened. She would not stop until she found who was responsible. But as she stepped out of the cabin, she felt it. A presence. Someone was there. She spun around. The shadows of the trees shifted in the wind. But among them, she saw it, a figure. And then a voice. You should have left things as they were. A cold shiver ran down her spine. The figure disappeared before she could react. But she already knew what it meant. They were watching her. And the game had only just begun. Rosario's cabin was silent. Death had settled there, covering everything with its invisible, suffocating presence. Isabella stood still, her body rigid, her gaze fixed on the chair where the old woman lay lifeless. Her mind wavered between fury and pain, but her heart had already made a decision. She wouldn't stop until she uncovered the truth and made those responsible pay. She stepped out of the cabin and looked toward the dense forest. She knew someone had been watching her. Clenching her fists, she felt the rage burn inside her like liquid fire. She refused to be afraid. Not after everything she had survived. When she reached her car, her phone vibrated in her pocket. She pulled it out and glanced at the screen. It was Leonardo. She took a deep breath before answering. Where are you? His voice held genuine concern. It doesn't matter, she responded coldly. I need to see you. There was a brief silence before he spoke. Tell me where. She sent him the location of an old overlook on the outskirts of the city and hung up. She couldn't explain it over the phone. She didn't even know how. The drive was short. When she arrived, Leonardo was already there, leaning against his car, arms crossed. As soon as he saw her, his expression softened. God, Isabella, what's happening to you? She stepped out of the car without responding immediately. She didn't want explanations. She didn't want pity. She just needed a moment of peace in the midst of the chaos consuming her. Nothing I believed in was real, she finally said, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Leonardo watched her in silence before stepping closer. Tell me. Isabella exhaled slowly and closed her eyes for a second before speaking. My father is alive. He faked his own death. Leonardo frowned. That's impossible. I have proof. Isabella locked eyes with him, daring him to doubt her. And not just that. Victoria wasn't my enemy. I spent years hating her, planning her downfall, when in reality, she was trying to save me from him. Leonardo looked away for a moment, processing what he had just heard. It means my father wasn't the man everyone thought he was. And if he faked his death, it was for something far darker than we ever imagined. Leonardo ran a hand through his hair, visibly shaken. What are you going to do now? Isabella took a deep breath. Expose him. Leonardo looked at her with a mix of admiration and concern. That will put you in danger. I'm already in danger. A tense silence hung between them before Leonardo stepped even closer. I don't want anything to happen to you. Isabella felt a knot form in her stomach. She couldn't afford to feel anything for him. Not now. I don't need you to protect me. This isn't about protecting you. It's about the fact that I care. Leonardo's words hit her harder than she expected. She didn't know how to respond. He held her gaze for a few more seconds before stepping back slightly. "If this is what you're going to do, then I'm with you." She shook her head. "You can't." Leonardo let out a quiet, ironic laugh. "Of course I can." Something inside Isabella cracked. Her whole life, she had learned not to trust anyone, to keep her distance. But now, for the first time in a long time, someone was willing to stand by her side without asking for anything in return. Leonardo. He didn't let her finish. "Don't tell me you can't love. Don't tell me you don't feel anything, because I know that would be a lie." Isabella clenched her jaw. "That doesn't change anything. It doesn't change what we have to do. But it changes what we are." The tension between them was unbearable. Too many unsaid words, too many buried emotions. But at that moment, the sound of branches snapping in the distance made them both turn sharply. Isabella felt her chest tighten when she saw the silhouette between the trees. Sombra. But something was wrong. The dog moved sluggishly, his fur matted with dirt, his breathing labored. "No." She immediately dropped to her knees as Sombra collapsed in front of her. There was blood on his side. "What did they do to you?" Leonardo rushed forward, quickly examining the wound. "He's hurt, but it's not fatal. We need to get him somewhere safe." Isabella ran her hand over Sombra's head, feeling his body tremble beneath her touch. The dog tried to move, and with visible effort, began dragging himself in a specific direction. "He's trying to lead us somewhere," Isabella said, her eyes filled with determination. Leonardo helped her lift Sombra carefully, and together they followed the path the dog was trying to show them. They reached a hidden cabin deep in the forest. The door was slightly ajar, as if someone had been there recently. They entered cautiously. The interior was covered in dust, but on the main table, something caught their attention. Documents. Isabella stepped forward and began rifling through the papers. Bank records. Secret transactions. And then she saw it. A photograph of her mother. Her blood ran cold. Beneath the photo was a report. Date of death, April 10th. Cause, homicide. Killer, Samuel Lombardo. The paper slipped from her hands. Her father had killed her mother. She felt the world crumble around her. Victoria had been telling the truth. Leonardo picked up the papers and read through them, his face filled with disbelief. No. Isabella felt her stomach twist. All this time, she had been searching for the truth. Now it was right in front of her. And it was worse than anything she had imagined. Her legs trembled, but she forced herself to stay standing. She looked at Leonardo with an icy expression he had never seen before. "I'm going to expose him." Leonardo nodded solemnly. "I'll help you." But before they could say another word, a sound made them freeze. The click of a gun being cocked. Isabella's heart stopped as she slowly turned around. And there he was. Samuel Lombardo. Her father. Standing in the doorway, a gun pointed directly at her. The shadow of a man who had controlled her life without her even knowing it. "Hello, daughter." His voice was deep, almost mocking. "You've stepped into something you shouldn't have." The darkness was impenetrable. Isabella felt the pressure of the ropes digging into her wrists as the car moved along a road she knew all too well. Her eyes were covered with a thick cloth, but she didn't need to see to know where they were taking her. The forest. The dense air carried the scent of damp earth and the memories buried in this place. Her mind wavered between fury and fear, but she couldn't let fear take control. She had spent years preparing for this moment. Samuel's voice echoed inside the car, low, mocking. "You should have left the past alone, daughter." Her stomach twisted at that word. She was not his daughter. Not after what he had done. "And you should have stayed dead." Samuel laughed, as if he found her words amusing. You've always been stubborn. You're more like me than you think." Isabella didn't respond. She refused to give him the satisfaction of knowing he had affected her. The car came to a stop. Rough hands pulled her out, forcing her to walk. The ground crunched beneath her feet. She knew exactly where they were. The same forest where Victoria had abandoned her. The same forest where her life had changed forever. Samuel shoved her hard, making her fall to her knees. "Poetic, isn't it?" he said in a tone that was almost philosophical. "Everything started here, and it will end here." Isabella lifted her face, feeling the icy breeze against her skin. She bit the inside of her cheek, forcing herself to stay calm. "It won't end the way you want it to." Samuel leaned in close, his breath a foul mix of tobacco and moral decay. "We'll see." The sound of a gun being cocked shattered the silence. Isabella's chest tightened. She had imagined countless scenarios, but not one ended with her dying at his hands. Not after everything she had fought for. Just as Samuel lifted the gun, a ferocious growl erupted from the darkness. Sombra, the dog, wounded but still alive, sprang from the underbrush and lunged at Samuel with primal rage. The gunshot echoed through the forest. The world froze. Isabella saw Sombra collapse. The dog whimpered, his body trembling on the ground. The air left her lungs. Samuel smirked with satisfaction, pointing the gun at her again. "One down. Now it's your turn." A second gunshot interrupted the moment. But it didn't come from Samuel. Isabella turned her head and saw a figure emerging from the shadows, gun in hand. "Victoria, you're not going to touch her." Samuel's expression changed. His features hardened as he lowered the gun. Look who decided to show up. Victoria walked forward, her gaze locked onto the man she had once feared. "You've done enough damage." Samuel let out a dry chuckle. "And what are you going to do, Victoria? Kill me? You don't have the guts. You never did." Victoria clenched her jaw. "I don't need to kill you. You're already dead inside." Samuel took a step back and made a fatal mistake. The wet earth gave way beneath him. His balance failed him. The abyss swallowed him whole. The forest took him. The sound of his body crashing against the rocks echoed through the night. Samuel Lombardo died in the same forest where it all began. Silence. Isabella barely breathed. She looked at Victoria, a storm of emotions impossible to describe. "Why?" Victoria stared at her, exhausted. "Because I couldn't let him hurt you." Something inside Isabella broke. She didn't say another word. She ran to Sombra, falling to her knees beside him. The dog was struggling to breathe. His eyes looked at her with the same unwavering loyalty as always. "No, please," her voice cracked. She gently ran her hand over his head, feeling the warmth slowly fade from his body. "You fought for me until the very end." Sombra wagged his tail slightly. One last gesture. Before he closed his eyes forever. Isabella's heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. Silent tears slipped down her cheeks. Her hatred faded in that moment. All that remained was pain. Victoria stood there, watching her. After a long time, Isabella rose to her feet. She looked at Victoria, her eyes red with tears. She said nothing. She no longer hated her. But she didn't love her either. All that was left was emptiness. Days later, everything had changed. Leonardo was by her side. Revenge no longer mattered. The past had died in that forest. Hatred could have consumed them. But forgiveness would set them free. What did you think of this story? Tell us in the comments. What would you do in a situation like this? Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share this video to show your support. It motivates us to keep bringing you thrilling stories every day. Don't miss the next incredible story coming up on your screen. We truly appreciate having you here with us. Click on the links appearing right now. We have an exclusive selection of captivating stories just for you. See you in the next video. Take care.